Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Alec Walker. For years, Alec Klein investigated cases where people were convicted of crimes they didn't commit. Suddenly, Alec found himself on the other side, falsely accused himself. In a coordinated media attack, he was accused of misconduct as a professor at a top U.S. university, and in a rush to judgment before he had a chance to defend himself, his life was destroyed. What happens when you have little hope? In the aftermath, Alec gravitated to the unlikeliest of places, among the unlikeliest of people, doing the unlikeliest of things. This is a first-person true story about faith, forgiveness, and redemption. Alec Klein is a best-selling author and award-winning journalist, formerly of the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal. His groundbreaking investigations have uncovered a wide array of wrongdoing and set free several prisoners who were wrongly convicted of murder and accused of other crimes. He also has helped dozens of excessively sentenced women gain their freedom through parole and commutation. Learn more about him at alecklein.net. Here to share this all too familiar story of betrayal, a rush to judgment, and a life redeemed is Alec Klein, author of Aftermath, When It Felt Like Life Was Over. Alec, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Thanks for having me, Rabbi. It's great to be here.
Well, it's great to meet you. I knew of your work in the AOL Time Warner investigation. I was actually with AT&T at that time, and we watched that very, very closely as we had divested and were thinking about other businesses to go into, and watch that unfold. And you know, it wasn't that I connected your name at the time with the story, but it was the AOL Time Warner cooking the books, kind of misleading everybody. And of course, AOL was the premier carrier, and they were the Facebook of their day. And their fall from grace and fall from favor was exposed by you in a incredibly detailed investigative report. And so I know that you are thoroughly aware that the media, the press, is a place where people are tried, sentenced, convicted, and they are actually for all intents and purposes, they are the fourth branch of government in this country, and maybe all over the world.
I couldn't agree more. I think we live in kind of a crazy time where people are accused. It's guilt by accusation. It's trial by media, and it's a real problem. As you pointed out, you know, the media has so much power. It can destroy people's lives overnight, instantly, as happened to me. And it's a real issue because nowadays, you know, what is true? What do we know to be true? So much of it is partisan. The media, the left, the right, depends on what we consume as media. But it's a real concern for me because I was an investigative reporter for many years, as you pointed out, at the Washington Post. I was at the Wall Street Journal before then. But the standards have changed. It used to be that you couldn't simply report an unverified fact. You couldn't just put out rumors because of the obvious problem, which is you could destroy people's lives just by virtue of putting it out there. But as you know today, anything goes. You can say anything on various media outlets. It goes out there. I actually blame this to some degree on the internet. With the internet, and we're all publishers, right? You just take your smartphone, you push a button, and you're a publisher. You don't need the delivery trucks. You don't need the big buildings and the printing presses. And I think, in my opinion, what happened is as people were putting out news all over the internet, the traditional media companies realized they had to do something, and so they've responded. And so now you have all sorts of information going out there, but a lot of it is false or unverified. And the result is that people are destroyed left and right. You know this as well as I do. Many people have actually killed themselves over false allegations that have been reported in the media. And I'm concerned about the way that the news is sometimes compiled. What is the verification before they put the information out so that we can consume it? Nowadays, as you know, sometimes we'll make an accusation, said, well, 20 years ago, somebody said something to me or did something to me. Now, how do we know this? They'll say, well, I said it to somebody else 20 years ago. That, by the way, is the telephone game. It's unverified information. It's secondhand information. It wouldn't even stand up in a court of law if you were trying to prosecute somebody for a crime. It's hearsay. And yet that is now the standard of proof, and it's not even proof. It may lend some credibility to somebody's accusation, but it's not proof. And yet that's where we are today. We see it in all the major media outlets. It's a real concern of mine. I actually worry the most for children. Children are, out there with their smartphones, and they're putting things out there, and they're saying things about each other. They're being bullied online. There have been all sorts of cases where children have themselves killed themselves over false and damaging things that have been said about them. And how do we stop this? How do we introduce a different way of doing things? But there's, in my opinion, a tremendous amount of vitriol on social media, on the internet, and people have this sort of knee-jerk reaction to sort of attack. It's a real problem, I think.
I want to go back to your father and to a little bit of your upbringing, because your dad was a journalist and rose to become editor-in-chief of at the time, was as rock solid, and it was kind of the benchmark for there were a couple of magazines that people relied on. They relied on the authenticity, the veracity of the report. I remember my parents saying to me, well, if it's on TV or if it's in Time magazine, if Garrett Nutley or Dan Rather or any of the journalists say it, it must be true, because it wouldn't be there if it wasn't true. And I think as I was growing up in the 50s, that was the case. There was the veracity, there was the honor among the press, and there was a commitment, and it wasn't about sensationalism, it wasn't about driving ad revenues. You had radio, you had TV coming on, but it was still radio. I grew up in Pittsburgh, KDK, the very first radio station and the first TV station. Broadcasts were there. And if you heard it, it was true. There was a certain amount of fear in putting something out there. And so I know that in the editors they had to have rock solid before they'd put a story out. When did that start to change?
Oh, gosh, it's such a great question. Just to answer your question, my father was the editor-in-chief of the New York Times Magazine when I was growing up, and I think it's fair to say he taught me a lot of what I know about journalism just over the dinner table. As a child, he would ask me, so what happened in school today? And I would start rambling on without making much sense. And then he'd say, stop and start all over, because I wasn't being clear. And a lot of journalism is about being clear and concise. But to your point, it's also about accuracy and about fairness. And early on in my career, when I was in high school, I joined the school newspaper called The Spectator. And the very first assignment I got was about a burglary that had occurred at the school. Someone had broken into the school. So I did some reporting, took some notes, and I went back to my father that night before I had finished writing the story, and I said, hey, what do you think? So my father, he took a look at this story that I had drafted, and he said, this is terrible. He said, well, did you interview the school administrator who oversaw the store that had been broken into in the school? And I said, no. He said, well, go do it. And I said, well, it's a school night. I don't know where she is. And he said, look her up in the telephone book. By the way, Rabbi, this was when there was a telephone book, one of those thick books.
Right.
So I looked up her name in the telephone book, and there she was. I called her up, And I said, I'm really sorry to bother you, but can you tell me about this burglary? She told me about it, and I went back to my father, and he said, okay. He said, did you talk to the police about this burglary at the school? And I said, no. And he said, well, go do it. And I said, well, it's a school night. I have schoolwork. He said, just get on the subway. This was in New York City. So I got on the subway, went down to the police station, interviewed the police, came back to my father with that information. He still wasn't happy. He went through my notes, and Rabbi, I did one thing right apparently, which is I interviewed a school security guard, and this security guard had worked at the school for about a quarter of a century, and she said something like, this is the worst thing I've ever seen. So my father took that information and he said, step out of the way, let me try to fix what you wrote here. And he refashioned a lead that said this was the worst breakout of burglary in nearly a quarter century, and he kind of shaped the story. And that for me was a bit of magic about how you can't simply just write a story and put it out there. It's got to be verified. You've got to interview people, you've got to check it out, you need to confirm it, reconfirm it. But to answer your other question, this all began to change, in my opinion, with the introduction of the internet in the late 90s. As that began to develop, in my opinion, the internet has become weaponized. And so, in other words, it's no longer that you see a story in the Washington Post where I worked or the Wall Street Journal. It can be anywhere. Anybody can create their own website. Anybody can use social media to put information out there. And nowadays, as you know, none of it has to be verified. They put it out there, and you'll see the crawl at the bottom of the TV screen says, this is unverified, or this is just a rumor. And I'm thinking, well, gosh, if it's unverified or if it's just a rumor, why are you telling it to me before you've verified it? You're about to destroy or hurt somebody or someone or something without even knowing the facts. And yet that's where we are today. It's very much an accepted form of journalism, which is not what I grew up with, and what I don't think it's the way to be, because it's just irresponsible. So it's a real problem for all of us, I think.
Well, unfortunately, the First Amendment and then the libel laws don't line up. And a lot of people invoke the First Amendment right of freedom to speech and convert that into being able to write lies. But the libel laws, if you're willing to go out and sue, and you know the cost of good counsel in a libel suit, you're talking $500 to $1,000 an hour. Then trial time, if you don't have $1 million budget to take on a major entity or several $1 million, or you're backed by one of the advocates, you have no case. And you're not, and it doesn't matter if you win, right, because people have already formed their opinion based on the misinformation.
Absolutely.
In your particular situation, and as you open the book, there is a, and it's very interesting because I have 3 authors on every day, and I read every one of the books that I interview. However, there's some books I read every page, but then, like your position, which made me laugh out loud, I do exactly what you do. I will open every book that is given to me, and I will read up to a point. And then, if you haven't made your case and hooked me, I will then go to the last chapter, I'll flip it over, I'll go to Amazon, I'll look at the summary, all right, and say, okay, well, that's what you were trying to say. I don't need to read the book in order to understand that's what you're trying to say. The synopsis is better than the book, and go from there. So actually, when I got to that part of a very big turning point in your life, I had to laugh, and that's when I sent you the email that said that you and I we share a ministry of suffering, betrayal, and I'm totally on the same page. You and I are kindred spirits in that way, that we've experienced something very similar. You start out the story in abject despair. It is the rawest form of emotion that you can possibly express, and that is the contemplation of how can I plan out my death in a way that will not implicate me as being guilty, but I don't know if I can stand up under the pressure of the heaping amount of lies and the amount of false testimony being given when the forensic evidence, which was 10 years of outstanding anonymous reviews by your students, not a single accusation of anything other than stellar performance, which got you pay raises and tenure and all the things that went with it. There was nothing forensically to back up any statements which were made against you, but yet your reputation was destroyed at the stroke of a pen. And the rejection that followed that was so instantaneous, it was like strychnine, it was like swallowing a poison pill. It was instant death for you.
It was, even as you're saying it, it brings back a lot of emotions, because, when you've spent your life trying to help other people, as I did as an investigative reporter, investigating wrongful convictions and false accusations, it was really surreal to be on the other side of it. And, I, at first, frankly, I really was struggling with the fact that I didn't want to live, And it's a hard place to be, because when you have children, you live for them, and it was a very difficult period where, frankly, my response was to I was on prescription medication, quite a bit of it, and I was also drinking alcohol, and I was aware of the fine print, by the way, of the combination, which that it might kill me, and I was okay with that. I spent many hours with my face directly in the dining room rug. Literally, I was on the floor, and I could barely move, and it was a really it's hard to describe, because when you're abandoned by everyone and your life has been utterly destroyed in every possible way, your reputation, your career, your income, your future prospects, you're socially shunned, you're professionally ruined. It's all over false accusations. It's really this, it's even hard to really digest it all at once. And I couldn't focus on anything in particular. I couldn't read. I couldn't watch television. None of it was computing. The one thing that I could do, and I can't explain it, was I could read books about Jesus. And I would order one book after another and from Amazon, and I would read the book, and usually a day or two, I'd kind of just race right through it. And it was a focus of mine. I can't really tell you why, but it was something that sustained me as I was literally on the floor. And I have to also say, I had a number of friends who did reach out to me during this time, from all over the country, actually. And at first I didn't really understand what was happening, but they were trying to come to my aid. And I began to realize that, wait a minute, almost all of them were followers of Jesus, actually. It wasn't something that they would necessarily say at first, but it became so obvious that everyone encircling me was a follower of Christ. And it was hard to not sort of see that. And I began to kind of think about this more and more. Maybe that was what also got me reading about Jesus. But then one of my good friends, he invited me to Oklahoma. He said, hey, I have a friend who wants to start a nonprofit helping inmates who are either wrongfully convicted or excessively sentenced. And that happened to be something I'd spent much of my career doing and helping inmates with. And he said, why don't you come out here and see if you can help with this? And I thought, gosh, sounds good to me. But I was actually told by my lawyers at the time, no, do not go under any circumstance. And I said, well, why not? And they said, well, you're supposed to be dealing with your own destruction and your situation with the university. And I said, well, I don't really care. I'm going anyway. And so I went to Oklahoma, and it was the first time I began to sort of feel sort of useful. Like, it wasn't about me. I wasn't worried about me. I was worried about other people. I was worried about inmates who talk about real suffering. These are inmates who have lost everything, their families, their lives. The suffering inside of prisons is actually hard to describe. It's so intense. But I found myself really locked into this, Rabbi, where I was able to come up with a system that helped a number of women who were sentenced to nonviolent crimes. These were primarily drug offenses. And we were able to help dozens of them regain their freedom through parole. I was also able to help a number of other inmates, mostly women again, who were able to get out through commutation, a form of clemency, if you will. And I did this over the course of many months. And I have to say that in a strange way, it helped to heal me a little bit, I think, because I was able to sort of focus on what was important, which was this, kind of mission or calling to do something to help people who are voiceless, people who don't have anything and who have run out of options. They have no one else help. They've largely been forgotten. And, it was something that meant a lot to me, so I'm really glad that I did it. But I have to say the destruction in my own life was, I like to think of it as a 360 suffocation. It affected every part of my life, and the people that I love as well, my children, my family, everyone, they were all impacted by it as well. It actually even affected the center that I had run. It was this center that helped people who were wrongfully convicted. Well, that center essentially collapsed and disappeared after I left, and which is a real shame because there are so many people who need help. And so I wish that there could be more to be done about that. I, by the way, continue to help inmates with their cases on my own. I do this on a pro bono basis. I hear from inmates virtually every day. They call me where I pay for the phone call. They write to me. I talk to people who are connected to inmates. It's a part of my daily life, really, to try to help them. And I have to say, not all of them are wrongfully convicted. Many of them perhaps actually did commit the crime that they were convicted of. But I also happen to believe in forgiveness and mercy, in that did they pay the price? And this, some people might not agree with this, and that's okay. But at what point is enough? If somebody's been sentenced to life without parole, for instance, in other words, where they've been in prison for decades, 30 years, at what point is it that they are allowed to continue with their life for a second chance? I'm thinking of one inmate at the moment. Her name's Lisa Ray, and she's in Oklahoma. She's served 30 years in prison for a murder. That, by the way, she didn't actually commit the murder. She didn't pull the trigger. Her brother did. But she's not the same person that she was 30 years ago. She was a young person then. Now she's a bit older than I am, and she's not the same person. In fact, she has her own prison ministry right now where she spreads scripture in the Bible and the teachings within the prison itself. And I'm thinking to myself, well, gosh, doesn't that kind of a person deserve a second chance? Haven't they paid the price? And maybe they should be set free. And I think that there's a lot to be said about that in the world today. I think there's not enough forgiveness in the world as there should be. And in fact, you know this much better than I do as a scholar, but when I read the Gospels, I have to tell you that's one of the things that sort of blew my mind, which was it's about forgiveness, it's about redemption, restoration. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, you know this better than I, but Paul was the prosecuting Jesus' followers. Right. And yet, of all the people, to be turned into the champion of Jesus was somebody who couldn't have been worse. And yet here he is, St. Paul. And so I think that there should be more of that in the world today. But yes, the destruction was full of anguish and despair, and to some degree, it's still a daily struggle, to be honest.
Alec, your background is you had a Jewish father that wasn't really a practicing Jewish father, bar mitzvahed, but not really living the Jewish lifestyle, and a Japanese mother who had her own belief system. So the coming to faith with a Jewish father under the Nuremberg test, you're Jewish. Under the rights of Aliyah, the laws of return of Israel, you're Jewish, and you would be recognized as having a Jewish father. You wouldn't be recognized as Jewish, halakhically Jewish, unless you had a Jewish mother, but you would still be able to get citizenship in Israel. The biggest struggle that I had in the betrayal that I went through, and I think you can probably really relate to this, is I could not reconcile, and even to this day I ask the question, what was it about me that made you believe that I was capable of doing such things?
Yeah.
What did you see in me? What indication did you have that I was a person of a corrupt moral character, or that I was on the fringe, or that I could be tempted that way, or I could commit such an offense to the people that I served? What was it about me that made you think that I could do such a thing, that you would believe that? It should be your nature to say, no, that's not possible. This is a person above reproach. This is a person who has served faithfully. He was by my bedside when my mother died. He prayed for my father when he passed away. He did the funeral. He was there with the family counseling. He slept in a chair by my side in the hospital for 3 days. This is the kind of man this is. And now you're saying these things, and people are saying, oh, yeah. Oh, I believe that. Oh, yeah, I can see that. I can see that. Well, here it is now 7, 8 years later, and people are surfacing and saying, you know, I was wrong. Yeah. I was wrong. But God is our vindicator, and I think that's a lesson that you learn. But did you struggle with that you know, you had 10 years of working under a system where you were rated by students anonymously?
Correct.
So there was no identification whatsoever. They could say whatever they wanted about you as a professor. And not one of those reviews of you as a professor ever indicated anything other than outstanding. The worst thing they said about you was that you were a tough you gave tough assignments, and you held people accountable to the assignment, and you did what your father did to you. Go back and do it again. That's not good enough. Okay, we taught you the 5 W's, and you covered the 5 W's, but you just did it with dates, times, list of names. No, you need to tell a story. This needs to be woven into a story. You just can't give me a list of facts. And so you might have been tough, but fair. But in 10 years of anonymous reviews, not a single indication of anything that would be considered to be inappropriate was ever levied against you. And then
I would go even further.
Please.
It's actually 10 years at Northwestern, but then even before that, I taught at Georgetown University and at American, so that was 15 years of teaching, and not once was I ever accused of mistreating any students of any kind. In fact, as you pointed out, it was quite the opposite, where they said that they loved the experience, they felt that I really cared about them, and that they learned a lot, and it was a wonderful experience. So, and in my mind, trust me, if you say or do anything that offends a student, they will, in fact, say things in these anonymous evaluations because there's no repercussions. They could say whatever they want. And I know in other cases with other professors that, in fact, does happen. They'll say, oh, they're mean or whatever. That never happened. It was the opposite in my case. And so I have thought about this on a daily basis, really, which is how could this happen? But part of it is you have to understand some of the accusations themselves, which really never came out when I was destroyed. So, for instance, several of the students who filed complaints against me were filing complaints about their grades. They thought that they should have gotten an A- instead of a B+, or they thought they should have gotten a B+ instead of a B, which, by the way, I gave to them 7 years earlier, but they still weren't happy with it. There was several students who complained that there was a chair in my office that was slightly lower to the ground than my chair, which, by the way, it was a chair for my children because they're small people. But these students who complained said that there was a power differential. They actually used the same language. I didn't even know what power differential meant, but that because their chair was slightly lower than mine, that there was this sort of power differential. Although I should add, there were other chairs in my office they could certainly sit in. And there were all sorts of other complaints. There was a student who said that I mocked her foreign accent while on a school trip to Florida. Well, first of all, my mother speaks with a foreign accent. She's Japanese. But I looked up my records, and it turned out I wasn't in the state of Florida when this student said that I mocked her accent in Florida. There was another student who, I didn't even remember, this was about close to a decade earlier. She said that I never gave her the chance to take my class or to participate in the center that I ran investigating wrongful convictions. I didn't even know who this was, but I looked back at my records and I found the email exchange where I said, you can take my class, you can work at the center, and she never responded. Now, why would she come forward all these years later and accuse me of something that was clearly false? I can't tell you. You know, these things are hard to understand. I think there was a bit of a pile-on effect, if you will, when you are sort of portrayed as a monster or in the media. You know, it's, as you were pointing out, you know, it's sort of this instantaneous reaction. By the way, when the attack occurred in the media, literally almost overnight, some students that I did not know, had never taught, put out a template on, I think it was Facebook, where they said, here's how you can complain about him. And they had literally kind of written sort of a template. This was what you could use to encourage other students to complain. And that's, you know, started this chain reaction. There were other students who I didn't teach who started an online petition to have me removed, even though I had never taught them, didn't know who they were, and none of the facts, by the way, had come out. This was just what was reported in the media. And in fact, even further, there were a number of professors, journalism professors, who issued a public letter supporting the attackers, even though these professors who are teaching journalism didn't know any of the facts. And so, in other words, there was this kind of rush to judgment. There was no way to even fight against this. My life was instantly destroyed. And, you know, what are you going to do? You know, it's the time we live in. And it was also at the peak of this sort of, you know, Me Too movement, when there was a lot of sort of attacks left and right. And I should say, I believe that the Me Too movement began with a worthy goal, which is that, you know, women have been mistreated for centuries. And, you know, so it had a great beginning and has helped in many cases. But I would say that in some instances, I think it maybe has gone too far. This idea that everyone of a specific set of people should be believed is ripe for some sort of problem. You know, as a journalist, I could tell you, no particular demographic should be believed just because they say it. We need to verify it. We need some sort of due process where we investigate the claims to see if there's any veracity to it. But we live in a time when that's sort of all out the window. And, you know, what are you going to do? But that's what happened to me, and it was very, very difficult to go through it. But fortunately,
Alec,
here we are.
Alec, your journey of faith began where almost all of our journeys of faith begin, and that is either we have come to the end of ourself or we've lost complete control over our circumstances and we have nowhere to turn. You found some of your answers in Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Christ, and being a legal journalist for the Chicago Tribune, he went on a quest to disprove.
That's right.
And there are many who have gone on that quest. As a Jewish believer myself, I've now taken the position 24 years after coming to faith that, listen, the world has had 2,000 years to prove that he wasn't the Messiah.
Right.
And they have not brought one irrefutable piece of evidence to prove that he wasn't. And you've been working at it for 2,000 years. Right?
Yeah.
You've been at it since the day that he was born. You have been out to disprove that Jesus was the Messiah. And you have not been able to come up with one shred of irrefutable evidence. Okay? That's every Jewish scholar. All right? That is the Hebrew University. That is the religious and the Haredi Jews in Israel who will tell you that he was not the Messiah. It's a large part of our heritage that he was not the Messiah, and yet there's not a single shred of evidence. So we're in good company of being wrongfully accused.
Right.
You in particular are in very good company, and maybe I can put your journey into perspective. Joseph was given a dream by God, and he delivered the message of that dream in what was received as an inappropriate manner. That was his crime. The perception that he delivered the message in an inappropriate way. That maybe he was presenting it with a little bit of arrogance, that my brothers are going to bow down to me, and then to his mother and father, that my parents are going to bow down to me. And it irked, and it brought up the ire and the jealousy, and he was his father's favorite, and so that fed into this. And so here he is, he's given a dream, two dreams in particular, excuse me, and his brothers abandoned him. The span of time between the time the dream was given to him and the dream was fulfilled was 25 years, including time in prison. But yet, his closing argument, his summation of his 25 years of experience was this simple statement, that what you meant for evil, God worked for good so that many would be saved. You and I are in outstanding company, including Jesus himself, who one of his 12 trusted betrayed him.
The story of Joseph, if I might say, is actually one of my favorite stories. And I'm kind of almost embarrassed to say that I came to it pretty recently. My first exposure to it was when I read it in the Bible, actually. I didn't even know about the musical Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoats. I knew nothing. But I remember reading the story of Joseph in the Bible and thinking, wow. And it was sort of a page turner, really. If you read it, you're like, you want to know what's going to happen. He's been falsely accused of sexual misconduct. He's been imprisoned. All these terrible things are happening to him. And I wanted to know what happened. And I have to say, Rabbi, that I came away from it. And I think about that story a lot because it is about how, it's suffering. It's all this inexplicable suffering that he went through. And he couldn't have possibly known that there was a purpose to it, until later when he saved countless lives from starvation. And so it's this beautiful story because I often think about how, we all are going to suffer. We all have suffered. We may not know why, but that there could be and there is, in fact, a reason for it. And I just, I hold on to that, through my own suffering. And if I could go back to the Lee Strobel story, to me, that was really the beginning for me. I was aside from being a mutt, I was a non-believing mutt, and I didn't really believe in anything. In fact, it was one of my greatest fears was that when you pass away, that was it, that there's nothing. It's just absolute darkness, and it used to really cause me all sorts of anxiety when I thought about that. But I was investigating a case, and I was talking to a friend, and I said something like, why do bad things happen to good people? And, that's my idea of small talk, And so my friend, he passed me a book. He gave me a book, which was The Case for Christ. And I remember distinctly thinking, I'm not going to read this book. I didn't believe in anything. I didn't think, when I looked at the book and I saw The Case for Christ, I thought, I'm not going to read it. But as you point out, as an author, I like to read the beginnings of books. So I read the beginning of the book, and this is a true story. The beginning of Lee Strobel's book is about how he is investigating a wrongful conviction, which is exactly what I do. He was a journalist, which is what I was, and he was doing it in the Chicago area, which is where I was. And I thought, well, that's kind of coincidental. Maybe I should keep reading. So I read the whole book, and he did a wonderful job of showing the historical truth, accuracy that in fact Jesus existed, which I thought was a myth. I actually didn't know that. I didn't know Jesus existed, but it was clear, it's incontrovertible that he existed. And I know that's not much of a discovery, but for me, it was big because the next thing I thought was, well, Lee Strobel keeps talking about this other book, the Bible. Maybe I should just read the Bible because that's what he keeps referring to. So I got myself the Bible, which I keep by my side at all times, and I read the Gospels first. And that just, that's what really did it for me, because if you read the gospel, it's, everything that Jesus said holds up, like not just 2,000 years ago, but today and into the future. You can't read that without coming away saying, this is perfect. And that got me on a journey where I started to tell my children bedtime stories from the Bible, which they happen to love because they're great stories about Jesus, And I would tell them stories, and they loved it. And then the next thing you know, I was getting a haircut, and my barber was on her cell phone, and she was speaking in another language. And when she got off, I said, "Oh, what language is that?" And she said, "Aramaic." And I said, "Oh, Aramaic." I said, "That's the language that Jesus preached in." She said, "Of course, I know that." She said, "Do you go to church?" And I said, "No." At this point, I'd been reading about Jesus and I'd been reading the Bible, but I thought, gosh, maybe I should go to church, So I started going to church, and then the next thing I thought, well, gosh, maybe I should get baptized. And so I got baptized, which was just last summer, and now I'm on my journey. But it's I still consider myself a newbie, if you will, but to me, it's a part of my daily life. I read devotionals, which are sitting here at my desk. I read the Bible. I'm actually reading about Job right now, which also feels appropriate. All the suffering that Job goes through, and yet he remains faithful. Because in my mind, it's what you said, which is out of the suffering comes good. That somehow God finds a way to make things good, even out of our worst situations. And to some degree, I have to admit, despite the destruction, there are things about it that I'm thankful for. That I spend more time with my children. I'm closer to my faith. We're having this conversation that I can go forward in a level of peace about the world and the world we live in today.
It's a story of biblical proportion that parallels the betrayal of Jesus by Judas, the closest one to him, the ridicule that he received at the hands of Rome, the scourging, the plucking out of his beard, the Jewish rejection, that he was scorned, he was rejected, there was nothing about him which was appealing, and it rocked their world. And so, when you look back at your life and you say, okay, as an investigative journalist, I brought exposure to the misdeeds of others. That was the mission, to expose the AOL Time Warner. You have other award-winning journalistic efforts which were investigative reports that uncovered wrongdoing or deception. And it's interesting that there's a passage in Scripture that says, "Judge not, lest ye be judged. By the same measure you judge another, so you shall be judged." And when we enter into this realm of we are put in a position of uncovering, then we ourselves put ourselves in a glass house, and all of a sudden we're now being examined, and everything we say is being examined. When I went into the ministry, I made a commitment that I would record every spoken word in front of a group of people. And I have kept that practice now to go from audio to video. I don't speak in front of a group of people that it is not recorded. And that is so that you can say you think I said something, but I can say go back and listen to the CD and see if you still think I said that, then come back to me with your Bible open and come to my office. But nobody ever did, because I didn't say what they thought I said. Okay? So I kept a record, and I did that for my own protection, because I knew that I was going to be, the more I was out there, the more I was going to be misquoted. The more it was going to be, but you said. Well, no, that's not what I said. That's what you think I said. And let's go to, so that's unfortunate that you have to be in such a position that you have to have forensic evidence to prove that you didn't do something. Not that you did something, but that you didn't do something. And that's the position I was put in. And unfortunately, you can't prove a negative.
That's for sure. Right.
And
exactly.
That is something that we see in the Bible. This is why there's a commandment that says, do not bear false witness. By the testimony of two or more, something should be established. And you were not given the opportunity to face your accuser. When you don't work, when you're not in the legal process, due process is not afforded to you. Right. It's a constitutional right under the judicial system, but it is not a constitutional right under the employment system, and therefore you're subject to the rules and regulations and whatever people want to levy against you. And you know, the granting of tenure and the continuation of employment and free will employment or employment at will, all those things, people have this free hand now to really do whatever they want without repercussion.
Absolutely. I mean, I can tell you that when I went through my own destruction, it was under what's called Title IX. It's a federal law about how these proceedings are handled internally at universities, and I can tell you that it was shocking to me how little due process there was. And, you were not allowed to cross-examine your accusers. I couldn't produce the hundreds of people who could have testified to my character and conduct over the years. I was told they were essentially character witnesses. You're sort of in this situation where you can't even have a lawyer in the room on your behalf, even though you're being grilled by a lawyer. And in fact, there's now been a move more recently to try to fix some of these problems with Title IX, the fact that the accused have virtually no rights and they are often destroyed by it. But I got to tell you, it goes beyond the Title IX issue. It's this world that we live in where, as you point out, it doesn't take much for somebody to be attacked, accused, and destroyed in the court of public opinion. And I got to tell you, even in the realm of criminal justice cases where we are supposed to have this advanced criminal justice system, there are tremendous flaws within it. So in other words, there have been studies that show that people's memories are malleable, that they can be altered over time, and in fact they are. So what we think occurred 10 years ago, 20 years ago may not have actually occurred, but that there's been this sort of distortion of your memory of what happened. And one of the other things is eyewitness identification. You think you saw something, you think you saw a crime, it may have happened right in front of your face. Well, there have been studies that show that we are very fallible about what we think we saw. And further, people will even admit to crimes that they didn't commit. I mean, that sounds kind of crazy, doesn't it? Why would you confess to a crime that you didn't commit? And yet it happens not infrequently under duress sometimes, where they think they have no other way out of the interrogation. They're being promised things if they admit to the crime, but it's incontrovertible. People have confessed to crimes they didn't commit. And so, it's interesting. If you're not affected by this, you may not realize that if you're accused of something, if you're in trouble with the law, you may not realize that if the system makes mistakes, in that people are wrongfully accused, excessively sentenced. It's just part of the broader problem. We actually, by the way, Rabbi, have the highest incarceration rate in the world here in the United States. We imprison more than 2 million people. I think we spend more on prisons than we do on education. And there's, I think, something wrong with that. What are we doing that we're creating this industrial complex of criminal justice where people are subbed into these prisons for decades on end in many cases? So it's a real problem.
It is. What you went through is the same as a grand jury. And a grand jury, you can't have a representation there. You can't bring any witnesses. It's purely for the prosecution to build their case and to levy their case and present their case without you being able to defend your case whatsoever. And it's a very skewed system that although in America it's the presumption of innocence, that is not the case in practicality and reality. And because people are people, they have their own agenda, they want to be validated, they want to be justified, and they will do it at someone else's expense as they did in yours. But yours is a story that ends with redemption. Yours is a story that ends with vindication. And the vindication doesn't come because you were exonerated or that there was some big correction and retraction. It's that you are now doing work on behalf of others, which is bringing redemption to their life and writing letters to parole boards and advocating for those who have been persecuted like you have. And I can only give you this word of encouragement, is the will of God will never lead you where the grace of God cannot keep you. And had you not gone through this, maybe you would not have been able to see as clearly what it's like to be on the other side of this picture and why you have become so effective in launching Matthew 56 ministry, and you have devoted your life to the service of the Lord, and God used these trials to refine you so that maybe the rough places, maybe the hard places, maybe the places that needed to be tenderized had to be tenderized within your heart, and that stony parts that we all have are replaced with the heart of flesh. And now you are uniquely able to not only advocate for them, and get them a temporary reprieve, but you can actually share the gospel with them and get them an eternal reprieve. And you have been promoted by God to not just be an advocate for them on earth, but the promotion is Alec Klein is now an advocate for them in heaven. And that is the greatest honor that God can bestow upon anyone. This is the aftermath of your story.
Said I couldn't have said it better. I can tell you that even before all of this, I used to talk about and write about what I call the journalism of compassion. So this was even before I came to my faith, but at the time I was writing about and talking about how it's important for us as journalists to be compassionate, to understand that our words can hurt people, they can kill people, they can do great damage. And I was trying to tell this in a way to explain that our ambitions as journalists are not as important as other people's lives. I actually wrote about it in one of my previous books, and I also talked about it when I gave talks all over the country. What I didn't realize was that in some way I was kind of espousing what Jesus was talking about without even knowing that this is what he had talked about, because I wasn't exposed yet to the Gospels. But you're right, ever since my own destruction, I'm much more, I'm not the same person that I was before, and I have more compassion, I think, for others, and understanding the pain that they're going through, and understanding, that forgiveness is important. I realize how fallible I am as a human, and that I have a long way to go, but that there is a clear calling for me to help others who are suffering, because I really believe in that it's in the Bible, right? Suffering is throughout the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament. King David and everybody else goes through tremendous suffering and doubt and fear. And it was kind of a comfort, in a way, to see that because you realize that that's part of the human condition.
Amen.
And that we have to kind of go beyond that. So it's been helpful to me. Actually, as I've been dealing with inmates more recently, I can't tell you how often faith comes up, their own faith.
Well, it's encouraging. It is a profound and provocative story, Aftermath, When It Felt Like Life Was Over, by Alec Klein, an award-winning journalist, a noted professor, and now an advocate for those who are imprisoned and helping them get parole, sentences commuted, clemency, and advocating for others. It's a powerful read. It is an extraordinary story of one who found himself on the receiving end of a great deal of injustice, but now can be used by God to help others navigate by faith this very crooked path called life. Alec Klein. Find him at alecklein.net. Visit ignitingnation.com. Click on today's show, and you'll find a link to get the book. Alec Klein, what a blessing it is to call you friend, brother, and look forward to seeing you again. Thank you for being on the program.
Thank you. It was a great honor for me, Rabbi. Thank you so much.
Thank you. God bless you. We're going to take a short break, and when we return, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.